She was 58 years old when her own son stood in the doorway of the house she had raised him in and told her, without quite raising his voice, that there was no longer room for her under his roof. Her name was Margaret Pell, and the young man who cast her out was her son Everett, who had inherited the family farmstead upon his father's death and who had, within a single year of his marriage to a woman named Louisa, come to see his widowed mother less as family than as an inconvenience taking up space his new wife wanted for herself. Margaret left that house with a single trunk of belongings and $11 saved quietly across years of selling eggs and mending, and when she arrived in the small prairie town of Amity Creek, with nowhere else to go, she rented, for 50 cents a week, a tiny tool shed behind the blacksmith's lot that no one else had wanted to live in for a decade. She told herself it was simply shelter, nothing more, a roof against the coming winter, and nothing to be proud of. But beneath that shed's rough plank floor lay something sealed away and forgotten that would not only restore to Margaret everything her son's cruelty had taken, but would give an entire town back a fortune it had spent years searching for in all the wrong places. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Margaret Pell. If you have ever been made to feel unwanted in a place you once called home, tell us in the comments. We would be glad to know you are not alone in that particular sorrow. Margaret Pell was born in 1837 on a modest farmstead outside a small Illinois town, the daughter of a woman named Hester Applegate who worked as a seamstress and laundress for the wealthier families of the county, and who raised Margaret largely alone after her husband's death in a threshing accident when Margaret was only 6 years old. Hester was a woman of few words but considerable practical wisdom, and she raised her daughter with philosophy she repeated so often across the years that it became, for Margaret, less a saying than a kind of scripture, that a woman with nothing could still have everything she needed, provided she learned to keep her own accounts, trust her own hands, and never depend entirely on any single roof or any single person for her security. Hester taught Margaret needlework as a trade, but she taught her something else besides, something less commonly passed down to daughters in that era, which was the keeping of careful, private financial records, a skill Hester herself had developed out of necessity after her husband's death left her needing to manage what little money passed through her hands with precision that could not afford a single wasted cent. It was an unusual education for a farm girl in that place and time, and there were women in the county who considered it faintly improper that Hester Applegate taught her daughter to read a ledger as carefully as she taught her to read scripture, but Hester was unmoved by such murmuring, telling Margaret plainly that a woman who could not account for her own money was a woman who would always be at the mercy of whoever controlled it for her. Margaret absorbed this lesson so thoroughly that by the time she was 16, she was keeping the household accounts for 2 neighboring families in exchange for goods and small wages, developing a reputation in that modest farming community as a girl with an unusually careful eye for numbers, someone who could spot an error in a merchant's tally or miscount a harvest weight faster than most grown men in the county. She married at 20, a steady and quiet farmer named Josiah Pell, a good man if not a particularly ambitious one, content to work his modest acreage and leave the household's financial matters entirely in his wife's capable hands, an arrangement that suited Margaret well and that she managed across their marriage with the same careful precision her mother had taught her. They had one son, Everett, born in 1858, and Margaret raised him with love, though perhaps, she would later admit to herself in quieter moments, with rather less of her mother's plain practical wisdom than she ought to have passed down, indulging him in ways Hester Applegate would surely have disapproved of, in part because Josiah himself doted on the boy, and Margaret, grieving the 2 infant daughters she had lost before Everett's birth, found it difficult to deny her only surviving child much of anything. Josiah Pell died in 1884 of a sudden apoplexy while working his fields, leaving the farmstead of Everett, then 26 years old and already married to a young woman named Louisa Danforth, the daughter of a moderately prosperous merchant family from a neighboring county who had, from the earliest days of the marriage, made her preference for a household unencumbered by an aging mother-in-law increasingly and pointedly clear. Margaret, in the years immediately following her husband's death, continued to manage the farmstead's accounts as she always had, believing, perhaps naively, that her decades of careful stewardship over the family's finances had earned her a permanent and unquestioned place within its walls. It took her longer than it perhaps should have to notice that Everett had, over the 2 years following his father's death, quietly begun taking over the very accounts she had kept for 3 decades, not out of any newfound interest in bookkeeping, but as became clear only gradually, at Louise's persistent urging that a grown man ought not to have his elderly mother managing money that was rightfully his own. The autumn morning that Everett told his mother she would need to find lodging elsewhere came without warning that Margaret could later identify, though she suspected, turning the memory over in the months that followed, that it had been building for some time beneath a surface of politeness she had simply been too trusting or too tired to see through. Everett did not raise his voice, and he did not, to his own small credit, put her out without any provision at all, offering her a portion of the modest savings that remained in the household account after Louise's insistence that the farmstead could no longer comfortably support 3 adults on one income. But the sum he offered when Margaret finally counted in the privacy of a rented room in town came to only $11, a fraction of what she knew from her own decades of careful accounting. The farmstead's finances could easily have spared without hardship to anyone. Margaret did not argue the point with her son, though it cost her something private and considerable to hold her tongue, because she had learned, across a long marriage and a longer life, that arguing with a person who has already convinced themselves of their own righteousness rarely accomplishes anything beyond exhausting the person attempting it. She took her $11, her single trunk of remaining belongings, and made her way, over the course of several days' travel by wagon and on foot, to the small prairie town of Amity Creek, chosen mostly because a distant cousin of her mother's had once mentioned it favorably decades before, and Margaret possessed, in that uncertain moment, no better direction to travel in than one vaguely remembered kindness. Amity Creek, when Margaret arrived there in the autumn of 1886, was a modest but reasonably settled prairie town, its economy built around a handful of farms, a small mercantile, and a blacksmith's forge that served the surrounding farming community's need for tools, wagon repairs, and shod horses. It was the blacksmith himself, a broad and taciturn man named Cornelius Vance, who offered Margaret the tiny shed behind his forge lot when she inquired, with what remained of her careful dignity, about the cheapest possible lodging the town might offer a woman with almost no money and no immediate prospects. The shed had once served as a tool storage building for the forge's previous owner, and had stood empty and increasingly neglected for the better part of a decade since. Considered by most in town too small, too drafty, and too close to the noise and heat of the forge to be worth renting to anyone but Vance, who was not an unkind man whatever his gruff exterior suggested, offered it to Margaret for 50 cents a week, an arrangement that suited both her limited means and his own indifference to a building he had never found any better use for. The shed itself, when Margaret first surveyed her new lodging, was a single small room barely 12 feet square, its walls unpainted plank, its single window cracked and patched with oiled paper rather than glass, its floor a rough surface of wide wooden boards laid directly over packed earth. It was, by any reasonable measure, a humiliating step downward from the comfortable farmhouse she had managed for 3 decades, and Margaret spent her first night there on a borrowed cot, listening to the distant ring of Vance's forge hammer during the daylight hours that preceded it, telling herself with the same plain determination her mother had instilled in her that a roof, however modest, was still a roof, and that a woman who could keep careful accounts could surely find some way to keep herself besides. It was during her second week in the shed, engaged in the practical business of sweeping accumulated dust and debris from the floor's rough boards, that Margaret noticed one board near the room's northern corner sat very slightly higher than its neighbors, its edge catching against her broom in a way that the others did not. She might, on another day or in another frame of mind, have dismissed the small inconsistency as nothing more than ordinary settling, but Margaret Pell had spent a lifetime trained to notice small discrepancies, whether in a ledger's columns or merchant scale, and something in her practical nature would not let the observation rest unexamined. She knelt, worked her fingers beneath the board's raised edge, and found, with some effort, that it lifted free of the floor entirely, revealing beneath it a shallow cavity dug into the packed earth, lined roughly with old sacking, and containing within it a small, heavy strong-box secured with a simple but sturdy lock. She worked the lock free that same evening using a bent nail, and the patient persistence her mother had once shown coaxing a stubborn hem to lie flat, and found inside, when the lid finally gave way, not the modest coin or trinket she had half expected, but a substantial collection of gold coin, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, along with a bundle of papers in a careful, aging hand, and a folded letter addressed simply, "To whoever finds this beneath my floor." The letter, as Margaret read it deep into that first night by the light of a borrowed lamp, had been written in 1876 by a man named Thaddeus Kroll, who had, according to his own careful account, been the forge's original owner and the very man who built the small shed Margaret now called home, using it not merely for tool storage as his later reputation suggested, but as a private strong room where he kept, hidden from view, the accumulated proceeds of a modest but genuine gold strike he had, made years earlier while prospecting briefly in the Western Territories before settling in Amity Creek to establish his forge. Kroll's letter explained that he had never spent the gold nor spoken of it to anyone in town, both from a natural frontier caution about displaying sudden wealth and from a private, growing conviction, detailed across several pages of his careful handwriting, that Amity Creek itself was owed a debt he had never found the right occasion to repay. That debt, as Kroll's accompanying papers made clear, traced back to the town's founding decades, when a group of the earliest settling families had pooled their modest resources into a communal fund intended to purchase and maintain the town's original grain mill, a structure essential to the survival of every farming family in the surrounding county, since without a working mill the nearest alternative lay a full day's difficult travel away. Kroll's papers detailed, in the same careful hand as his letter, how a portion of that communal fund had been quietly diverted decades earlier by the fund's original treasurer, a man Kroll named as Silas Grubb, who had used the misappropriated money to purchase private farmland for himself under a different name before the fraud could be properly traced, leaving the town's mill perpetually underfunded and in poor repair for years afterward, a burden that Kroll, arriving in Amity Creek years after these events and hearing the story secondhand from older residents, had come to feel a strange and persistent obligation to correct, even though the fraud itself long predated his own arrival and implicated him in nothing whatsoever. Kroll's own gold, accumulated through his brief prospecting years before he ever set foot in Amity Creek, represented, by his own careful calculation recorded in his papers, very nearly the same sum the town's founding fund had lost to Silas Grubb's fraud decades before, and his letter explained that he had intended, for some years, to quietly restore this sum to the town's mill fund under some pretense that would not require him to explain its true origin, an origin he feared might raise uncomfortable questions about a prospector's gold suddenly appearing in a blacksmith's modest savings. But Kroll had died suddenly of a fever in 1876, the same year his letter was dated, before he ever found occasion to act on this long-considered intention, and the gold had sat forgotten beneath the shed's floor for the 10 years since, the shed itself passing through a series of indifferent owners and renters who had, as Margaret herself very nearly had, seen nothing in the small building beyond its cramped and drafty inadequacy. Margaret sat with Kroll's letter and papers long into that first night, feeling the peculiar weight of holding, quite literally in her own two hands, both a decade-old grievance the town itself had likely long since given up hope of ever correcting, and the precise means to correct it. She thought of her mother's old lesson about keeping careful accounts, about never depending entirely on any single roof or any single person for one's security, and she thought that Thaddeus Kroll, whoever he had truly been beyond these careful pages, had wanted his quiet debt repaid by someone patient enough to notice what a decade of careless owners had overlooked. She resolved, with the same plain determination that had once made her the most trusted keeper of two families' accounts before she was even fully grown, that she would be that someone. The following weeks were not without difficulty. When Margaret brought Kroll's letter and papers before Amity Creek's town council, a body consisting mostly of the county's more established farmers and merchants, she was received with a courteous but visible skepticism. Several council members suggesting delicately that a newly arrived woman of limited means, living in a rented shed, might have motives worth examining before her claims about a decade-old gold cache were taken entirely at face value. It did not help Margaret's case that Silas Grubb's own descendants still lived in the county, his son Harmon Grubb having inherited the same farmland his father had purchased under a false name decade before, and having become, in the years since, one of Amity Creek's more prosperous and locally influential farmers, a position he was not eager to see disturbed by old accusations against his father's memory. Harmon Grubb argued before the council, when the matter was raised formally, that Kroll's papers proved nothing beyond the ramblings of a dead man's guilty conscience, that his own father's land purchases had been entirely legitimate and properly recorded, and that reopening decades-old grievances against a respected local family served no purpose beyond stirring up trouble that could benefit no one but a stranger seeking to establish herself in town through manufactured drama. Margaret, however, had not spent a lifetime keeping careful accounts without learning precisely how to trace a paper trail, and she spent the better part of 2 weeks at the county courthouse, examining land records with the same patient thoroughness her mother had taught her to bring to any ledger, until she located the original deed transfer from decades before, filed under a name slightly but unmistakably altered from Silas Grubb's own, a discrepancy that, once identified, proved surprisingly easy for the county recorder himself to confirm as an irregularity worth further examination, armed with this corroborating evidence, and with the quiet support of Cornelius Vance, who remembered Thaddeus Kroll personally from his own boy in the town and vouched plainly for the letter's handwriting as genuinely Kroll's own. Margaret brought her complete case before the town council a second time, this time accompanied by the county recorder's own written confirmation of the deed's irregularity. Harmon Grubb, faced now with documentary evidence considerably harder to dismiss than his own indignant protests, grew notably quieter as the council's mood shifted visibly in Margaret's favor, and when several of the town's older farming families, who had lived through the mill's lean years and remembered all too well the hardship its underfunding had caused, spoke in support of finally settling the old grievance, the council voted to accept Kroll's gold as a legitimate restoration of the founding fund's original losses, formally noting in its records a historical irregularity in the Grubb family's original land acquisition, without pursuing any further legal action against a fraud committed by a man 3 decades dead. Harmon Grubb did not lose his farmland, for no court had ever formally voided the original deed within any actionable period, but he lost, in the span of a single council meeting, the untroubled respectability his family's local standing had rested on for 2 generations, a loss that would follow him quietly through every future dealing in a town that now remembered. However, politely no one spoke of it directly, exactly where his family's prosperity had first taken root. Margaret Pell did not claim Kroll's gold for herself, believing, as Kroll himself clearly had, that its rightful purpose lay in the mill fund it was always intended to restore. But the town council, in recognition of her role in uncovering and properly documenting a decade-old fraud that had cost Amity Creek's founding families dearly, voted to award her a modest finder stipend from the restored fund, along with formal permission to purchase the small shed and its surrounding lot outright for a token sum, a gesture that transformed her humiliating rented lodging into property she owned outright and could, with the stipend's help, properly renovate into a small but genuinely comfortable home. She used a further portion of her stipend, in a gesture that surprised no one who had come to know her careful, practical generosity over those difficult weeks, to establish a modest bookkeeping service for the town's smaller farmers, many of whom had never had access to the kind of careful financial guidance her mother had once taught her, ensuring that Amity Creek's newer generation of struggling families would have, at least, one person watching over their accounts with an eye too careful to let another Silas Grubb quietly profit from anyone's trust again. It is worth returning, before we close, to where this story began. A woman of 58, cast from her own son's home with $11 in a trunk of belongings, reduced to renting a tiny shed that no one else in town had wanted for a decade. Margaret Pell never reconciled fully with her son Everett, though she wrote to him once, some months after the mill fund's restoration became public knowledge throughout the county, a brief and dignified letter informing him simply that she found both shelter and purpose in Amity Creek, without asking anything further of him than his own conscience might eventually supply. She had, with her 11 remaining dollars and a lifetime of careful attention to small discrepancies others overlooked, bought back not merely a roof over her head, but the plain right to be useful and respected in a community that had, unlike her own son, come to value her judgment precisely as much as it deserved. We began this story with an old woman renting the cheapest, most humiliating lodging a small prairie town had to offer, cast out by the very son she had raised. We ended with a town's founding grievance finally settled after a decade of quiet neglect, a blacksmith forgotten kindness fulfilled 10 years after his death, and a woman who proved, at 58 years old, and with almost nothing left to her name, that being discarded by one person's carelessness does not mean the whole world has finished needing what you know. Thank you for spending this time with Margaret's story. If it moved you, please consider sharing it with someone who has ever been made to feel like a burden by the very people who owed them better. We would love to know, What is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? Tell us in the comments below. Until next time, stay close.